Hello everyone, this is Philosophy 74, right? Ethics, and we are doing, this is week 11. We are doing today Walter Benjamin, right? This essay, great essay called Critique of Violence. It comes from this book. The book is called Reflection. The essay is one of the last in the book. And so remember that tonight we are having a Zoom community meeting right at 8:30 right p.m. and I hope that I will see many of you. And this is the second meeting that we are having, Zoom meeting, and it's not a class. It is again, like I said, a way to, be in touch, right? Touch base, and a community meeting, I like to call it. And then we will have one final meeting, also Zoom meeting at the end of the semester during so-called final exam week. We are not taking a final exam. We wouldn't even in the face-to-face situation, all the more so now. But in any case, what I want to say is before we start the Benjamin class 11 for today, then we have 1 week left after today, right? Week 12. We are really getting close to the end of the semester. Just to make sure that we all know where we are and what we have done, the trajectory of the class this semester. Remember that we started part 1. The class is divided into 3 parts. Part 1, 4 weeks, right? I call that part ethics and the law. The distinction between ethics and the law, which is something I had said that even in the face-to-face situation that will be with us throughout the semester, right? So you should keep that important question, problem, and distinction in mind, right? The difference and very often the conflicts between ethics, right? The moral law, and the human-made law, the positive law, the redundantly, I may say, the legal law. So we did, after a general introduction in which we spoke about the just difference between just and unjust law. That's another way to speak about this. We started with our reading with Plato, right? Socrates / Plato. We did the Euthyphro, then the Apology, right? Where basically Socrates, that's his self-defense during his trial, right, which ends with his being sentenced to death and then ultimately executed, right, in prison. But then we got into, right, week 3. We saw Antigone, this great, important, philosophically important tragedy by Sophocles in ancient Greece. Keep that in mind as well. Then Martin Luther King, the same week we combined the two, right? Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail. So the question of the unwritten and changing laws and so on and so forth. Then Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative, and that was the end of the first part of the class. Then we moved to the second part, which I had called, right, in the syllabus, the theme for the second class is right, happiness, right? Happiness, excellence, dependency, and care, right? Happiness, excellence, or virtue. So we saw 2 weeks. We had right. We saw Aristotle, the Nicomachean Ethics, right, for 2 weeks. Books 1, 2, and 3. So basically on the question of happiness, right? Remember, then virtue, decision, and so on. Virtue or excellence, and then we did during week 8 we saw this great essay by Eva Kitei on the question of dependency. I call that the class for that week, for week 8, dependency and care. So we focused on Kitei, the question of dependency. We spoke about the issue of the very important question of disability. I also asked you to read a chapter from my book, right, my second book, on the question of dependency, again, disability, and so on. And then we moved from there to the third part of the class, which we are still doing now, right? I mean, I call that part of the class the ethics of civility, right? So we had ethics and the law, then happiness, excellence, dependency, and care. Sorry, I missed, we also after Aristotle and before Kite, we did Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher, where we introduced the question of care. And then, right, we did week 9 in the section, in the part called the ethics of civility. We started with Spinoza. We read some sections from the Ethics by Spinoza, then Nietzsche. Last week was the class was on Nietzsche, the video, right, on essay 2 from genealogy of on the genealogy of morals or morality. Okay, so today again Walter Benjamin. I don't want to be too long, right? Walter Benjamin, Critique of Violence, and I call the class for today Sovereign Violence, and the essay is Critique of Violence. And I ask you again, remember, do the discussion board entry. Say what is Walter Benjamin's view of violence and the police. So do you agree with him? Give some examples. Read again. I highlighted some passages for you. I will read maybe some of the most important. There is so much to say about this essay, which may actually be difficult. It's a little dense, perhaps, right? But in any case, the question of violence is, of course, very important in society, not only because there is all the time, right? I mean, behavioral, violence and so, but institutional violence as well. That is very important. And we have been seeing this from the beginning of the class. I mean, starting with the dialogues by Plato already in the Euthyphro, and then Sophocles, Antigone. There is so much in that play, in that tragedy, which is about the question of violence, the way in which very often in any given society people relate to one another in terms of violence for whatever reason. Violence is there, regretfully, to begin with, right? So that's the question of violence is one that unfortunately cannot be avoided, right? And the question of all, the violence that takes place in so many different forms, and we will see two ways in which Benjamin, this philosopher in particular, speaks of. You can Google his name and see some, I can't go into, but also very interesting and tragic life he had, right? I mean, he was escaping from Nazi Germany when then at one point he thought that he might be caught by the police, and then and then he took his life before the day before, probably boarding a ship to come to the U.S. Right? I mean, escaping from Germany as right. He was a German Jew, right? So like many people tried, many people escaped, many people tried. Many intellectuals, philosophers as well, among whom precisely Walter Benjamin, but he didn't succeed. But in any case, so in addition to this, he wrote so much, but very interesting philosopher in also, broadly speaking, the Marxist tradition. Very particular take on that tradition as well that Walter Benjamin has. Maybe you see some of this in this essay. But in any case, the question of violence, like I said, then we saw this throughout, right? Not only with, like I said, in Plato's dialogues in Sophocles and Antigone, in the letter by Martin Luther King, right? The segregation laws. I mean, again, tragic exemplification, illustration of precisely right institutional violence, right? I mean, and then also the question when we study the question of care dependency and so on, the question of how very often relationships can right be relations of power, and therefore the possibility of violence is there, how relationships can become abusive and so on and so forth, right? I mean of no domination, and so in any case critical violence by Benjamin begins by also, speaking about the critique of the law. In a sense, we go back to the question of ethics and the law somehow, right? I mean, the law and the violence that produces the law, that constitutes the law. At the beginning of this essay, you will see in your text, right? Let me go actually to the PDF, right? He says that's the very beginning of right, page 278, right? The outset of the essay, the task of, he says, Benjamin, of a critical violence, I'm reading, can be summarized as that of expounding its relation to law and justice, right? Usually we think about law and justice as the opposite, perhaps, of violence, but the idea is that there is an intimate relation between these two, between violence on the one hand and then law and justice on the other. For a cause, however effective, I'm reading again, becomes violent in the precise sense of the word only when it bears on moral issues, right? The sphere of these issues is defined by the concepts of law and justice, right? And then, because I want to, of course, I need to skip so many important passages. I read from, some of the most important pages, 278. He says this thesis of, then he speaks about natural law, the difference between natural law and the positive law. More or less, this is what we saw. Natural law, or whatever some people might call it, divine law, the unwritten laws that we also saw already in right, Antigone, for example, in also when we read Martin Luther King's letter and his reference to the medieval tradition of right, Saint Augustine, Saint Thomas, and so on, right? I mean, remember, I mean, an unjust law is no law at all. So what is the difference between then the law which cannot change and the laws, the positive laws that change all the time? Positive meaning that they are posited, to posit, to put, to place there by us, by humans, by societies, and therefore very often, as we know, these laws can be altogether unjust and violent. Okay, so in any case, that's the idea. Then he speaks about, let me see where I want to read this very important moment when page 281 is important. It's highlighted for you. Read that. Pay particular attention to that, but I want to read from page 284, right, when he says, when he speaks of the he says that violence, right, the function of violence, what is the function of violence vis-a-vis the law? That again, usually we think the law is actually one might think the opposite of what violence might be. But this is not only Walter Benjamin. No, let me say that there is I do that in when I teach my political philosophy class, but probably you heard the name of this very important philosopher, right, modern philosopher. His name is Thomas Hobbes. In Leviathan, when he speaks about sovereignty, is one of the earliest formulations of the theory of sovereign power, sovereignty, sovereign power, supreme power, and there too. And he's a conservative philosopher, and he says precisely that I'm not quoting but paraphrasing, right? But the idea is that the law, that inside the law you have violence, basically. I don't know. You can Google also his name, try to find out something, but I try to maybe say in a very simple way what Hobbes' theory is. He says that we move. I'm speaking about Thomas Hobbes now, Leviathan. You can read some of the central chapters in part 1 of the book, like chapter 13, 14, right, where he speaks about this. He says that there is this transition in human societies. Transition, actually, what brings about human political society is this passage that we make from a hypothetical state of nature, a state of nature, the condition, the natural condition, right, of humankind, in which there is no law, no political society, no society at all. There is nothing. All there is in that original condition, which is again, fictional in a sense, and hypothetical certainly. But there is, he says, Thomas Hobbes says that there is a war of everybody against everybody. There is this constant war, right? So life is unlivable, unsustainable in that natural condition, in that state of nature, which is a state of war, right? Constant war, and the threat of violence and violent deaths and so on and so forth. And so there is this transition whereby people make a contract, right, an agreement, right, and they decide to give up, right, these rights that they have in the original condition of the state of nature, where anybody can do as they please, right? I mean, there is no court of appeal, there is no law, there is no just and no unjust, according to Hobbes, in that state. Okay, so at one point people decide that remains a mystery how they come to that moment of deciding, even thinking about it and deciding, right? They decide to give up this freedom, unbridled freedoms and rights and powers. They are the same: freedom, right, power, right, at that state. And they give everything, they transfer, they give up all this, and they transfer all this to the sovereign, right? The sovereign, right, the king and so on, now makes the law, right? There is precisely the emergence now of the law, right? And everybody has to comply, because everybody has Hobbes claims voluntarily, right, given up their rights, right, abandon their rights, and so now they had to comply with what the sovereign says. So the sovereign makes the law. What is this law? Inside this law, you have all the unbridled violence that was there in the state of nature to begin with, right? There is this transformation of that, raw, if you will, violence into what now becomes the institutional type of violence of the sovereign, which is the law. That's what we call the law. I hope that I made this clear. I know, but again, contact me with questions. If you have questions, you can read that. So I'm, just to show also that what Benjamin says is something which we find already in the tradition, and in a tradition that is completely different from the type of thinking that we find in Walter Benjamin. But that's important. So he says that precisely the function of violence, right, the twofold function of violence, right, is precisely that of making the law and preserving the law. Okay, you find that on page precisely 284, and I put a note right in the margin so that you can see, right, where I say that this is when Benjamin is speaking about precisely this function of violence. If that first function of violence is called, I'm reading, the lawmaking function, this second one will be called the law preserving function. Okay, lawmaking and law preserving function of violence. Okay, so and then he goes on page 286, speaking more about this question of violence. That again, in the middle of that page, he goes back to the same characterization of it, and he speaks of violence again as being both law making and law preserving. Okay, I'm reading both law making and law preserving violence. Right? I mean, lawmaking, the making of the law, those who make the law, and so on and so forth, the powers, sovereign power, right? The power of the sovereign to make the law, and then preserving, right, which is law enforcement, and so on. The police, because he's going to speak about the police also in a broad sense of, right, I mean, policing in a broad sense, which actually today becomes really important and timely, because this happens, say, at the digital level again, the level certainly of what then became after Benjamin, right? Because he died during World War II, but the society of control, right, and the society of surveillance, right, in which we live today. So there too there is very often all this degree of violence, at times hidden, right, I mean, and it is more sophisticated than the maybe raw violence that one may find in the state of nature that Thomas Hobbes describes. A state of nature that, by the way, is often approached again when there is, I don't know, think about, and I leave that to you to elaborate on this, a civil war, for example, when the political, social fabric of any state, society, collapses for whatever, and then there is this state of, almost like the state of nature described by Hobbes, in which everybody can be an enemy, right? There is a war of everybody against everybody, again, at least virtually. Okay, so. And of course today with the pandemic unfolding, which is not only it began perhaps as a health crisis and a medical problem to begin with, but then of course became and it is now increasingly becoming politically very important, and we don't know what the world will be like, not only from the point of view of precisely health or the lack of health and so on, the point of view of medicine and public health, but also from the point of view precisely of politics, culture, the social arrangements, maybe, right, that the new social arrangements that we will see emerging at the global level as well, right? I mean, perhaps with an increased and more sophisticated system of surveillance and so on, perhaps with the question of violence is very important, right, in this sense as well, because it may happen at different levels, right? Situations of again, violence, right? But in any case, then, and I want to call attention to this when he actually speaks about the death penalty, and then there is a very important passage on the police, Speaking about violence, the law making and law preserving violence, right? When it is suspended, even, he says at the end of page 286, police violence, right, is emancipated from both conditions. It is lawmaking, right? Very often it becomes a matter, especially today, of a sovereign power. I mean, where sovereign power, supreme power today might be not only precisely like in the classic, time in the hands of the king, for example, right? One person only, one seat of power only, but it can be today more widespread, throughout precisely the bureaucracy, the police, the various ways in which the society of control functions, right? So it is lawmaking for its characteristic. I go over to page 287. Its characteristic function is not the promulgation of laws, but the assertion of legal claims for any decree, and law preserving because it is at the disposal of these ends. Basically, I don't know if this is clear, but just to, speak a little about this, a decree becomes then, by governing by decree means that whoever has power, sovereign power, can say, well, from now on, the situation is different, because there is an emergency, a state of exception, right? Because Benjamin is also addressing this question of the state of exception, right? And so there is a decree whereby, for example, I don't know, rights, civil rights, political rights, and so on are suspended, and so on and so forth. Okay, so, and he continues the assertion that the ends as the aims, right, the objectives of police violence are always identical or even connected to those of general law is entirely untrue. Rather, he says the law, and that's in quotation marks, in quotes, right? And this is very important. I say the law of the police really marks the point at which the state, whether from impotence or because of the immanent, again, if there are questions, just contact me, immanent, like intimate, right, connection within connections within any legal system, can no longer guarantee through the legal system the empirical ends that it desires at any price to attain. Okay, so again, like I said, it is dense. If there are questions, let me know. But there is an exception. So what usually works, business as usual, so on, it doesn't work as smoothly, and then there is the necessity of further action, right? And exceptional measures, right? Like as we see also today, in relation very often to the question of the, important, terrible situation with the pandemic, right? So Benjamin continues. Therefore, the police then intervene for, in quote, right, security reasons, right? And the word security has become so important, right, in the last, I don't know, 50, 60, 70 years. I mean, it was important before. I mean, Benjamin speaks of it, but certainly then with, our societies more maybe even from the technological point of view, more sophisticated systems of surveillance and so on, the question of security, as we know, is one of the most important, right, questions of our time. So, for security reasons, in countless cases where no clear legal situation exists, when, he continues, they are not merely without the slightest relation to legal ends, and so on and so forth. But I want to, read this next, the continuation of this. I skip a few lines when he speaks about the consideration, right? of the police institution, right? And then he says that its power, right, the power of the police, its power is formless, has no form, right? Like it's nowhere tangible, just like its own nowhere tangible, all pervasive, ghostly presence in the life of a civilized states. We are speaking about civility. I hope this is a key passage. Okay, so let me try to maybe unpack this a bit more, going back to something that I was saying already, that it is no longer the case, perhaps, that we have a sovereign, supreme, right, power of life and death, and so on and so forth, in one place only, right? Again, the king, whatever that is, the dictator, and so on and so forth. But it is actually, uh, it's nowhere tangible. Where is it? You can't really, find the place, the seat of this power, this sovereign power and sovereign violence. Therefore, it becomes all pervasive, ghostly, like a ghostly presence everywhere. Okay, so I hope that I made that a bit clearer, right, more clear. But it is this widespread diffusion of right, this type of violence. Okay, and though he continues, this is very important, right? And though the police may, in particulars, everywhere appear the same, it cannot finally be denied that, I'm reading, their spirit is less devastating where they represent in absolute monarchy, or